Hi, this is Dave Hoover. So as most of you know, we frequently get international visitors here to the center, and we're fortunate today to have somebody coming that has a perspective on soil health. So we want to be able to, Lisa's going to be with us for a couple of weeks. We want to be able to learn from her, to have a little technology transfer, a little knowledge transfer. Lisa's from the University of New England, which is not the United States New England, but it's in southeastern Australia. And for those of you in the room that aren't familiar with Australia, I'll draw you my 2-scale map of Australia. There it is. And Sydney is down here someplace, and Brisbane is up here, and Armidale is about there. Mm-hmm. So if you get confused where she's talking about, you can refer to my map up here.
Okay, so where's her?
On the other side.
It's
west. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Here.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
Yeah.
So we've been able to have several discussions with the staff, with Dr. Lorby de Bruyn. Are going to talk with some of the local lab testing folks in the state. So we're looking forward to having her spend some more time with us. She's primarily working with Dr. Susan Andrews on a joint project, but we're glad to have her housed here at the center, and looking forward to your talk today. So welcome, and we're looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I hope you can all understand me okay, my Australian accent. My work is with, I'll talk about my work, but I also wanted to put the perspective of my work into the relationship between farmers and natural resource management goals, and how the farmers' actions and activities might be able to meet the goals, concentrating on the area of soil health. So I'm going to actually begin my talk with a number of quotes which I've taken from policy documents, and those documents were actually mostly in the early 2000s, but they have sort of informed what we're currently doing. And then I'm going to talk about my particular case study where I interviewed farmers in the northwest of New South Wales, and talk about their capacity to align or support those current initiatives. So the first quote is from the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, and that's our biggest water catchment in the southern eastern part of Australia. And they had targets at the basin and catchment scales for resource condition will translate to targets for improving management at a property scale. We will need to evaluate the links between targets at different scales so that we can be confident that on-ground actions will lead to overall improvement in basin health. So the government documents from the 2000s reiterated this. They had a proposed target for landholders in rural areas, that the number of people actively monitoring resource condition, be that soil, water and biodiversity, would be able to guide their management practices to increase by 75% in 5 years. So that was quite a lofty target. It turned out that for this goal to be achieved, you really need some appropriate monitoring systems, which they actually hadn't developed. And this target was set without a clear idea of, at the time, the level of monitoring of natural resource condition by farmers. And my recent investigations, which I've been looking into particular ways of monitoring, show that in real terms the number of farmers sampling has remained relatively constant for the past 20 years. So it certainly has not grown by 75%. Another quote was about catchment targets. So in catchment action plans, which are developed for each of the catchment management authorities, and in New South Wales, just to confuse matters, we've changed our catchment management authorities to local land services, and they have a local strategic plan. So that just makes everything even easier to understand. But the idea was they were going to develop a target, and a target is a precise definition of an acceptable condition of a natural resource or combination of resources at a given point, at a given time, providing a broad indicator of catchment health. They should integrate the environment, social and economic outcomes communities want but should be expressed in biophysical terms. So they had to, all the catchment action plans had to identify key natural resource issues, set targets to achieve those, and actions to achieve those targets. So the management targets have been set by all those various local land services in New South Wales, and it was water quality, water sharing, biodiversity and ecosystem health, as well as soil health. So they had an example of a catchment target would be at least 40% of farmers located in the slopes area of the catchment using opportunity cropping to reduce deep drainage by 2010. So it's time bound, you have to achieve it by a certain time. So monitoring and evaluation was mentioned by many of these catchment action plans, but specific strategies to actually engage farmers in monitoring were not identified any more specifically than in terms of raising awareness, providing incentives and education. So, so the proposition, if you like, that farmers will actually collect, store and transfer information on natural resource condition that can be used by these catchment management authorities to monitor progress towards a catchment target such as this, the one I said, had not really been tested. And in reality, it didn't happen at the farmer level. What happened was the state governments, in our case in New South Wales, we have what is now called the Office of Environment and Heritage. They undertook the baseline assessment of catchment conditions in each of the 12 local land services. So what they did was for soil, these were the two targets they had. They had 13 natural resource management targets, but for soil, the relevant ones were an improvement in soil condition, and the other one was an increase in area of land managed within its capability. So the overall index, they developed an index, they developed a protocol for soil condition, and what they came up with for the state, so that's aggregating it all up, was that 3.7 out of 5 was the overall state of the soil condition. But their overall assessment was that the soils in New South Wales are in good condition, but there had been some noticeable loss in soil function for ecosystem services and agricultural productivity. If you actually looked at this more closely, what you'll find is they had up to 12 soil monitoring units per local land service, and they would have done 10 replicates of each of that. They would have tried to look at a land use continuum, so a range of land uses and some natural vegetated areas. And what they looked at was, particular soil profiles that the CMA or local land service has identified as key soil types, and they would have measured the soil properties. And essentially they were looking at risk of, a lot of time they were looking at risk of land degradation. So is it more likely to erode? Is it more likely to be affected by soil acidity and so forth? But if you like, they're still not monitoring, because at this point it's just, this is the baseline, and it's as yet in 2015, when I was meant to see if it's improved in soil conditions, this has yet to be repeated. So they were published in 2010, and it's still questionable whether they'll be doing it anytime soon. So, it's a big investment at the time, and not sure it's going to be repeated quickly. So this is just to give you an idea of those catchment management authorities. This is the ones in New South Wales, in this area here, and the local land services that they are now called do not have the same boundaries. So then we've now moved to different boundaries, and again you can imagine the awkwardness in now how we're going to aggregate data based on different boundaries. They're sort of vaguely, well, for a lot of these areas, this is the Murray-Darling Basin, which you probably have heard about, this area of southeast Australia. But you can see some of those CMAs are really quite big land areas. So the last quote is from Environmental Management Systems, and again I'm trying to emphasise the idea of a partnership between landholders and government, and the idea that government would like a voluntary response by landholders to improve land conditions. So they were also suggesting that linkages with key agencies to ensure actions by individual landholders on their own properties can align with regional targets and contribute to larger scale environmental outcomes. So this whole balancing of private versus public benefits. How do we get private landholders to contribute to what is actually a public good benefit? And interestingly for EMS, it really has not been widely adopted by farmers. In fact, the percentage is very low. So this was an initiative again around the mid-2000s or early 2000s, and really hasn't been widely taken up. So where does soil health fit into all of this? I suppose what I was looking at was the interest I had in researching this topic was that I observed that there were many kits, indicators and information packages on soils being developed by researchers without any input or consultation from the people for whom it was intended. So in this case, farmers. And also, you know, there's a bit of resistance from some scientists that we shouldn't be undertaking this sort of activity. The second one, so there, to me, this was the quote that I felt was sort of the dominance of the scientific methodology and the displacement of farmers from the knowledge generation process and problem-solving process to passive recipients from expertise from outside. So I was actually trying to avoid applying that hard science paradigm over the potential knowledge that I thought could be generated by farmers' experience and learning. I believe often a consequence of our frame of reference is that we have ignored the potential of local knowledge, and alternatively farmers have relied more on technology and science to solve their problems. So instead of recognising their own potential and experience to form their land management decisions, they've sort of relegated that to someone else. So ultimately, I was looking for a type of relationship between service providers and farmers that was more of a working partnership. So the benefits that I saw of involving farmers in monitoring via soil testing was to look at them to be empowered to be more self-reliant and to have greater abilities to diagnose their own problems. So at the time when I undertook this project, I was hoping that I'd come up with a soil health checklist that was commensurate with farmers' knowledge system, their everyday language and actions, and was more likely then to be used by farmers. So each checklist was also meant to be adaptable and flexible, so that's why I'll show in a minute, but I took a sort of locality approach where soil types and conditions were different. The provision of a soil health checklist was viewed as a vehicle to motivate farmers to keep a better paper record on soil condition. And at the time, I was fairly confident that a large number of farmers were soil testing, which I now realise was probably that maybe 60% were soil testing, but in reality, probably only 25 were doing it every year, 25%. So the motivation now, I think, was to extend that information that they already have if they've kept their paper record, or actually look at what the fertiliser companies have warehoused. So the next point was that I wanted farmers to be able to take more initiative on why, how, and when and where to conduct soil testing, and also to provide a common language for communicating more effectively about soil conditions. So, I wanted to be able to service providers and farmers to learn from each other. So this is where I was working. It's in that northwest corner of New South Wales, and those towns are regional centres, and clustered around those regional centres were farmers and service providers, which I interviewed. And this is actually 84,000 kilometres squared, so it's a reasonable area to travel around. And we interviewed 75 farmers and 26 service providers. So it's a qualitative study, and for a qualitative study it's quite a large number. It's probably not, for a quantitative study, but in terms of interviewing people in depth, it's quite a large survey. So the approach we took was importantly driven by the participants. So we didn't really we wanted to ensure that the prompts that were we had a set of core questions, if you like, but the prompts were adjustable. So we were going to be informed by what they were saying. We were only going to prompt areas where they started talking about those areas more in depth. So we're very determined, if you like, not to present a list of tick boxes, which often happens in quantitative surveys, where there's a predetermined idea of what the answers might be, and then people have to tick what's available. So we were driven more by what they were saying than, we had a core set, but not, oops, sorry. The next bit is that I very importantly, I know this might sound strange, but I made sure that the person interviewing, there was an experienced interviewer, but not a soil specialist. Because my experience with farmers is if they think you know something, they're going to start interviewing you or interrogating you about what you know about soil. And my whole point was to find out what they knew about soil. So to allow them to open up and to be completely honest about the relationship, we would tell them straight away, this person doesn't know anything about soil, wants to hear about what you know. And the idea was they weren't to be, we didn't want them to think they were being tested on their knowledge. That was not the idea. And that has happened in other soil health surveys, that people feel they have to provide a certain, correct answer. The other aspect of this was we used a qualitative software package that allows the building, prioritising and interrogation of themes. Now this package is now called NVivo, and it's a good package because it allows you can actually pull in all sorts of data, but we had the verbatim interviews, and they were coded against themes, and therefore we could actually build up some idea of intensity of speaking about a certain topic, as well as the words and language used by the farmers. So it's a really useful package. So what were their definitions like? And now I'm going to have to apologise because it now looks like I'm presenting quantitative, but I will give you some examples of the types of definitions farmers use, but essentially I just wanted to give you an overall feel for the key themes that were coming out. So the table is actually reporting on text coded, so it gives you an idea of the volubility or the dominance of certain themes in terms of how often they talked about them and so on. In terms of soil health, we didn't immediately launch into this question. We sort of would eventually get into that area after some introductory discussion. But they expressed more than one theme, so no one theme tended to dominate. In the actual definitions, if you like, they could often be characterised by the achievement of a healthy soil is not an end in itself. So that wasn't the main goal, but it was more a means to an end. Having a healthy soil was really the byproduct of their primary goal, which was about production. So more, and this has also been backed up by more recent research, which also found that landholders saw it as a means to an end. And the factors that they also found important were organic matter and soil structure. So as you can see, soil feel is the first one, and then soil organic matters on the third. So I give you an idea of their farmer definitions. One would say, as long as the crop looks good and strong, then we consider the ground is healthy. If you've got healthy soil, then you've got a healthy plant. Soil health means to me a soil that is capable of growing good crops and pastures, and that's high in nutrient level. It's high in microbial activity. It's not prone to erosion or subject to erosion. It has a good level of organic matter, and that's basically what I call a healthy soil. So that's a probably more longer definition than some, but some would be really focused on certain problems. So one farmer said, I think one with good structure tells me a lot. If it's very nice and loose and friable, I think that is a good soil. That's on your self-mulching grey soils. I mean, basically, if it's like that, it hasn't got any problems like compaction. So, you know, for some people it is about single issues, particular problems that they have had before. So features, what sort of features would they use to identify soil health status? So again, the similar top three, plant growth, soil feel and organic matter. And when we talk about plant growth, that was one of the highest features. Its dominance was that by looking at the form and colour of the plant, it was expressing the health of the soil. And this is also comparing, I haven't got the service providers up here, but service providers also rated plant growth highly, but even more so than farmers. So they actually talked about it 20% more than the farmers. And they had similar indicators. Soil feel, which is soil structure, was by far the most expressive feature used to describe soil health, a term that I had perceived as technical, I thought, as friable, was very widely used by farmers and was associated with a healthy soil structure and easy to work. However, service providers were less likely to use the term, and only a third used healthy soil structure as friable. Sodicity is another interesting comparison between a service provider and a farmer. A service provider said they don't hold together like other soils. The sodium to calcium ratio is out of whack, so the soil just falls apart, so they run together and set like concrete. So the farmer didn't talk about the sodium to calcium ratio, but said on the sort of sodic soils, it just runs together and sets. You get a hard setting crust on top and the plants don't grow well. So similar idea, but not necessarily the reason behind it. Organic matter was interesting too, because most farmers used organic matter, but only 13% used organic carbon, and I would be interested to know now, after a lot of more activity we had about carbon, you know, because this was done in the late 1990s, 2000, so it'd be interesting to see how that stands now, where all service providers used organic matter and 50% refer to organic carbon. So I think you'd find organic carbon would be more higher up. What was encouraging was the high proportion of farmers realising that carbon was only found in small amounts in the soil. It could be recognised by darkness in the topsoil, and farmers had realised that agricultural practices had depleted the amounts of carbon in the soil, and that to build them back up again would involve minimum tillage. Also, building up the organic matter levels in the soil would protect the soil from soil structure decline and crusting. So they knew the reason they needed to protect it. Soil life was really a more presence or absence. Is it there or is it not there, as an indicator of soil health, and that a living soil was important for water movement and soil structure improvement. So they looked at the relationships between the soil properties. I also looked at soil problems because I suppose one the counterpoint or the counterweight to soil health is land degradation, and these are the ranking of the different soil problems in the region, and soil structure decline is also includes soil acidicity and hard pan. You can see that there are 3 soil health issues of most concern, and they were soil fertility, soil structure deterioration and water erosion. At the time there was quite major flooding events, so I think that's probably why it was so prominent at that time. And to identify most of those soil problems, they used visual appraisal. So there's not much actual quantification, and their experience over the years. So the dependence was of observing changes in soil health, especially those more insidious soil problems like salinity or soil acidity was in the 2 hard baskets. So if you can't visually see it, and often with salinity, such as trees dying, they were recognising it far too late, that there's no early warning signs. So sodic soils were identified by observing soils' behaviour when wet and how crops grow, and that idea of the soils running together and setting hard. Now, in terms of what we do in Australia in terms of soil condition indicators, there are actually only 4 headline indicators of soil condition in Australia. We have soil pH, soil carbon, which has probably had a lot of work done on it recently, and wind and water erosion. And that's because they felt those were the easiest ones to monitor, especially on a large scale. But it does mean that it's not called soil health, it's called soil condition. So that's what we seem to be focused on. So how do farmers monitor soil? It's the attributes mentioned. 67% when they were asked how do you monitor soil, so I suppose it's not a time-bound thing, but how do you do it? Most farmers mentioned soil testing and also visual appraisal, while only a small amount talked about yield and protein of level of crop. So, and also yield was one they were a bit dubious about. Half of them thought it was the best, and the other half were not so sure about its reliability in terms of seasonal conditions. So what's the current level of soil monitoring? To be fair, I think the purpose is mainly nutrient requirements. That would be the main reason people are soil testing is a way of eliminating the causes of poor crop performance that they couldn't determine by the naked eye or to see what's depleted, what's missing to make it good. So that's their words. So hence a large proportion are talking about soil testing in relation to soil fertility and assessing whether there are adequate levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and to a lesser extent micronutrients. So it's a fairly limited test that they're focusing on. The work conducted by Bramley and Cook, which is a more recent project, also showed that trying to combine soil testing for different purposes like crop production and soil resource assessment was fairly problematic due to the low soil sampling intensity, and their belief, anecdotal belief, was that soil testing is integrated into farm management by the best farmers. So they felt that this bias towards those better farmers who are more proactively managing their soil would not necessarily represent soil condition across the board. Their other point was that they also felt that soil testing needs to become a more common practice for a wider cross-section of producers if it was to be used for soil resource condition assessment. The next point is that, so that was related to that point, when, where and how often is that, and I've got another figure in a minute which talks about that. The techniques used, well, it's interesting because farmers themselves, when you ask them how often you use soil monitoring, and they'll say it's ongoing or a continual process. So for them, it seems like they're always doing it whenever they're out in the paddock, driving around. And I suppose the classic test that a lot of my farmers talked about was the boot test, which was more for soil moisture, but just kicking the dirt and seeing how much stuck on the end of the boot. And simple test. So the boot test was a common one. But it seems to me that soil health at the farm level is not a documented process, not a formal documented process. And very few, only 16%, actually kept their soil test. So they might have had a soil test undertaken, but they don't keep it at that paddock level. So therefore, it's very hard for them to actually tell you what is their current status of their soil. And when you drill down and say, well, you know, how often are you actually sampling your soil testing a paddock, it may be 3 to 5 years, and often it's a different paddock. So that can be problematic too, because you can't see the results over time. So this is some recent data that I've collated, which shows you almost a 20-year period, well, 20-year period. And the idea here was to look at two aspects. On the left side, we have the numbers of soil samples per 100 hectares. On the right is just the volume of soil sampling, and this shows it has increased. So it shows that from 1990s to 2012, we have had a large volume increase in soil samples. But if you make two assumptions, one is here is number of sample per 100 hectares in cropping areas with full participation, you can see that the actual number of samples per 100 hectare is only about 1. If we turn to a more realistic assessment of participation by farmers in soil testing, you can see that if with a 30% participation, which is currently what soil testing is looking at like in Australia, you find that there is a higher intensity of soil sampling, but it still isn't particularly high overall. So you're looking at fairly low frequency of actual soil testing. So the next aspect that I thought would be useful is how do farmers view our actual soil agronomic information? And this is looking at Australian material. These are some of their quotes. Have it at home collecting dust. Take too long, well, probably takes too long to read, not take. Too much work. Read it and bin it. That's what I should do with some of my stuff in my office, I think. Good, quick, easy reference. So, you know, they had a range of views, and some of them weren't that complimentary, but that also were inundated with quite a lot of printed material. At the time when I was doing this, they had quite a lot of newsletters and various information coming through. And a lot of them preferred to be told. So a lot of them would have preferred to go to a field day, to go to some sort of session where they could be told what they needed to know rather than have to spend time reading about it. Another impediment was access, like if a publication went out of print. And one of the ones they most liked was on nitrogen, and I think that really sparked their interest because it fitted all their needs. So it was something that was relevant, specific to their needs. It was compact, it was robust, it was focused on a particular issue, it had good quality pictures, it was informative, and it had easy tab little sections so they could just flick to it. And GRDC, which is our Grains Research Development Corporation, also does what they call ute guides. And they're little books that are hard, you know, compact, just stick them in the ute, in the glove box, and they're easy to take around, and identifying weeds, various other issues that you might want to communicate. So this was also about the networks that they rely on. And I suppose you can see there's two dichotomies, if you like. Up on the top left is the one they rely on most, and the established networks would include a district agronomist, the family members, neighbours, or another farmer as expert. And if you look at social capital, this would be identified as the strong ties. These are the people that once they've got the information they want to, that would help them the most. The ones that they're least likely to be drawn to are community groups, committees, or non-government organisations. If you like, industry and the media are sort of sitting somewhere in the middle. And these will be classified more as the weak ties, and they're more to do with the people that may be affirming some of the knowledge they already have, but if they want to carry it forward, they really need that support of your stronger ties. So what are some of the things that need to change, if you like, to use soil health or how to monitor soil health? And one of the key ones is level and detail of record keeping, because what I found, even with just normal records, you may have a farmer who has 24 years experience, but they only had 14 years of records. And often their records were at the farm level rather than the paddock level. So more likely farm business records, especially rainfall, but very less detail at the paddock level. And soil health or soil testing was very low, with only 16% of farmers keeping their soil test records for paddocks. So there's no, it's very hard to look at the change if you're not keeping those records. It seems that most farmers kept the information about soil health in their head or jotted in their pocket diary, but it's very hard to make those comparisons. Often the fertiliser companies in Australia are the custodians of the data, so they would actually have the whole data set. The other thing, there's farmers move around a lot more than you imagine. So if they leave a property, and I asked a farmer who'd taken over the property, they were not left any records. So there's a loss of information, and also there's the idea that as the generation of farmers get older, and I think in the US they're even older than our farmers, but ours are average of 55, there's a potential loss of information. Okay. So also the soil sampling strategy would need to change, and they would probably have to rely, they rely a lot on the experts to help them with interpretation. So I think this is the last one before I get told. These are the main points that I thought that would help us make a better system for monitoring soil, and that is, it has to be relevant and adaptable, a transparent process for interpretation. The important need to be able to translate that data on our soil into management actions and use existing trusted networks for dissemination. Oh, I might say that first. I'll end on that. So people do it and do it well because they enjoy it and see a point in it. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you. These are some of my questions, but you might want to have a question.
All right, we'll open it up for questions. And while the people online have a moment to compose their questions and enter those online, I'll ask the people in the room with me if they have any questions. All right, we got one back here. Let me get this microphone to you, Zamir.
You mentioned something that caught my attention. The last sentence, you recognize or realize that the farmers move a lot.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and my question is, how does this, is that related to the land tenure and the ownership?
No, I just think, sometimes you assume, I used to assume farmers, generational, hand down through the generations, but what they might do is they might acquire, well, they might keep maybe they keep some of their original land, but they might acquire a neighbouring farmer or acquire someone else's land or farm further away to consolidate their holdings. So I think the thing is that they, sometimes their children don't necessarily want to, at the time, children weren't necessarily taking on the farming, so they might sell up and move away for that reason. So they've got their private ownership, so it's not, there's leasehold of rangelands, but for cropping it's private land, yep.
So, okay, so cropping is private. You don't have
Yeah.
any leasing or...
No. Well, there might be some share farming where they might lease, yeah. So there could be the same motivation to worry about soil conditions.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. I mean, did
Yeah.
you see any, in your interview, did you see that attitude, or were you able to kind of look at that
No,
shift in
actually,
the
I
attitude?
hadn't. Yeah, no, I hadn't. No, it's a good point, but I hadn't actually, in terms of the ownership question, I hadn't really delved into, what the difference between what might be a person that doesn't actually own the farm. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know what percentage of typical farmers, the percentage of land is leased, and do they typically maybe lease 25% of their land that they're farming, or
Well,
here it's about 50-50.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So no, I'm not really sure about that. I mean, I know that of course the rangelands is like a 50, 100-year leases. So effectively it is for your for your family and the next generation. So, but no, I don't really know the breakdown of how that compares. But I suspect ours isn't as high as that. I think it would be much more likely to be, and I think the share farming is where someone can't, they've either got so much land they can't afford to farm everything, so they just let someone else farm it and do the work, but they probably still own the land. Someone else still owns the land, yeah. Is that how you see share farming? Is that how it works here? Or
very
not?
frequently it's the farmer retires or dies, often it's the widow or the children that they retain ownership, but then they rent the land out.
Yeah.
And so then newer farmers, other farmers.
Yeah. I mean, that might be a situation where there's a young farmer who can only afford to share farm, but can't afford to actually.
But even seasoned farmers do it. It's very, very common here.
Yeah, okay.
And to answer Zamir's question, in the U.S., it definitely is. I've done interviews with farmers, focus groups, and they definitely, if they have uncertain tenure, why would they do? This is long-term investment, and so you don't want to do a long-term investment that you don't know that you're going to have in the long term.
Yeah, I just think there's this thing that people think, well, I'm looking at my land all the time. I should be able to tell if something's going wrong. But I've had that experience with Tasmanian farmers where they're cropping farmers. They were not, like vegetable cropping farmers on quite steep soil, and it was a verisol, so krasnozem or verisol, so a deep red soil, and fairly uniform in texture and in colour, so it's very hard to see change. But when they were taken to the native vegetation and shown unfarmed profile and realised how much darker the surface soil was, then they suddenly clicked, oh, we're not farming on our topsoil. But it wasn't until they saw a natural profile that hadn't been cropped that they realised, well, maybe I'm not, I have lost some soil. But so people could, I think some of them sort of feel because they're farming it all the time, they know what's happening. but you know, they don't have a lot of evidence, if you like. They don't have, yeah.
So an online question we have is, do agribusinesses also need training?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think what I found in the end was that there wasn't such a big divide between their language. You know, their language was, besides some of the technical terms, their understandings were fairly similar. And I think in training, in what way did the questioner think they needed training on which area, or?
Just says, do agribusinesses also need training?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting because I've done Grain and Graze recently, which was looking at working with farmers on mixed farming, and we often would get the agribusiness people coming along to those meetings as well. So I think they're open to it. I think the difficulty sometimes is that the agronomists aren't necessarily that, they might be more up on their plant side of things, and the diseases and all that sort of thing. But in terms of soil, I'm not sure how strong they are in their soil characteristics and so on. So yeah, possibly. But I mean, I didn't do a really intensive determination of which areas they need training in yet.
Got a question in the room.
Yeah, I was just curious, you know, NRCS has a big program promoting soil health and working with producers and trying to educate them on certain cropping practices, you know, cover crops, no-till. You know, based on the types of farming systems you have here, do you do the similar thing in terms of promote the same types of practices to promote soil health?
It's interesting because I've been looking at reading what you've been saying about soil health and different practices, and in Australia, one of the practices that's had a very slow gestation, which was minimum tillage, and then all of a sudden it's just taken off. So there was a long build-up period where it sort of was flatlining for a long time, and then from the mid-90s, it has gone from 20% to almost 75, 78%. So it's now. So it's pretty much saturated. But what's interesting about that, I think, is that, you know, people have adopted these sort of practices, but I don't. And when you look at their motivation, which some people have done, soil conservation is part of it, which is mainly about soil erosion. Soil moisture conservation is also very important, but also saving money in terms of fuel and that sort of thing. But you know, but it's not actually based on information on how their soil's improved. So they're doing it with the idea that it's helping with soil moisture conservation, helping with less erosion, but there's no actual, well, there's probably stuff for soil moisture conservation, but there's, and you know, there's obviously some academic stuff on less erosion occurs when you've got good ground cover, but you know, they haven't based it on their own soil information, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, the table you had on slide 18 that talked about their confidence in various various groups. I was wondering, being familiar with land care, kind of holding that up as a, you know, in my mind as a really, you know, great thing of, you know, groups of farmers. Would that come under the community groups?
Well, it's interesting because land care,
or is that government?
Land care is still around in Australia, but land care it peaked in about 2002 at 40% of our farmers were in land care, which is quite reasonable high level. But what's been a bit startling is that over the last 10 years, it's dropped to just only 20%, and a lot of that was to do with the funding arrangements. So they've actually reintroduced the National Land Care Program, and we'll wait and see. But I'm just wondering, what would have, Oh no, I did the wrong one. Yeah, I'd have to go back to my original data just to remind myself. Committees would be probably more things like the catchment management boards and things like that. Non-government organisations, yeah, at the time there was more things like Greening Australia, and which were tree planting groups and so forth. But yeah, so I suppose land care. Yeah, I'd have to remember. I'd have to go and check now because I can't remember where I put the land care ones. But it has been hard because a lot of people have got burnt out. You know, after land care originated in 1990, and a lot of people, just are over committees, over doing. Yeah.
That was actually a similar question online. Why were NGOs the least desirable?
Yeah, well, I suppose NGOs sitting outside governments, and sometimes why are they undesirable or desirable?
Yeah. Why are they undesirable?
Oh, least desirable. Yeah, well, yeah, I must say, I'm just trying to think why they're least desirable, but and this was in terms of information on agronomy, and I suppose some of those NGOs weren't seen as potential sources, like Greening Australia wouldn't have been a source of agronomic information or soil information. So it was very specific about the type of information they could get from those groups, and I think they just didn't see that as a potential source. And there has been more recent work done by the Australian Bureau of Agriculture, Resource Economics and Sciences, which also showed that government departments weren't seen as very influential in helping people make change, in practice change. That it was actually, their neighbours, their friends, farmers, other people in the community that were more influential in terms of getting people to change their practices. But this was just, I think, more on their views on where they would get that information. I don't think they saw some of those organisations as that useful in that context.
Yeah, in the States, it's always been, my daddy didn't do it, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, so tradition can be quite a strong...
And in some cases, non-governmental organization is viewed as anti-farming, anti-animal, like PETA.
Yes.
Which is...
Well, so at the time when this is probably more about information, but that some of them can be seen as not supporting the farming group. Yeah.
We do have a follow-up clarification to one of the earlier questions. Do agribusinesses also need training? And they're saying, for example, training on interpreting soil health testing or understanding soil processes and implementing management changes.
Yeah. Yeah. I would suspect that a lot of our agronomists try and keep up to date with the basics of a soil test in terms of the main nutrients and so forth. But and I think when it comes down to it, a lot of the soil testing information, only a small section gets used, and I think that's probably one of the other deficiencies is that soil testing can provide a lot more detail, but invariably only a small segment of it gets used, not the whole lot. And they don't, there's very little other than chemical testing. Even, there's not very much physical soil testing and even less biological soil testing. So, really the majority would be, phosphorus, pH, nitrogen, carbon, and, very little else, really. Maybe soil texture, but not always. That would just be